Nobody ever looked twice at Robert Jones when he walked down the street. That's exactly how he liked it. At 58 years old, he owned Skyline Airways, but you'd never know it from his appearance. He wore regular clothes, drove a modest car, and lived in a nice but not flashy house in a regular neighborhood. Robert started with nothing. Growing up in a small apartment above his grandma's shop, he worked every odd job he could find. He saved money from mowing lawns, delivering newspapers, and working night shifts at the local factory. After college, he spotted a gap in the airline market and took a huge risk with his savings. 25 years later, Skyline Airways had grown into the nation's fifth-largest airline, worth billions. But Robert stayed out of the spotlight. He never appeared in company photos or advertisements. Most of his 11,000 employees wouldn't recognize him if they bumped into him at the grocery store. He handled business through his trusted team, watching his creation grow from behind the scenes. 3 months ago, everything changed. The doctor's words still echoed in his mind. "I'm sorry, but it's pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The room had spun around him that day. Treatment options existed, but they were just buying time. 6 months, maybe a year if he was lucky. After the initial shock wore off, Robert made some decisions. He would fight the disease, but he would also live whatever time he had left with purpose. He'd always been so busy building his company that he never actually experienced it as a customer. What better way to see his life's work than through the eyes of a regular passenger? That's how Robert found himself at Gate 23 on a Tuesday morning, waiting to board Flight SL 342 to Chicago. The cancer treatments had taken their toll. His once sturdy frame had thinned considerably. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes from constant fatigue. He had good days and bad days. Today was somewhere in the middle. He watched his staff at work, feeling a quiet pride. The gate agents were efficient and friendly, helping an elderly couple with their boarding passes and calming a nervous first-time flyer. This was what he built, not just an airline, but a service that connected people and places. When his boarding group was called, Robert joined the line, his medical alert bracelet partially hidden under his jacket sleeve. He wore a simple button-up shirt, slightly loose now from the weight loss, and comfortable pants for the 3-hour journey. His medication was tucked safely in his carry-on bag. No one gave him a second glance as he shuffled forward in line. He was just another passenger, exactly what he wanted. The flight attendant at the door gave mechanical smiles to everyone, barely making eye contact. Robert noticed this, making a mental note. Customer service had always been his priority for Skyline. He found his seat in economy class -14B, a middle seat. He could have booked first class or even taken the company's private jet, but that wouldn't show him the real experience. As he settled in, he felt a sharp pain in his side, a reminder of why he couldn't waste any time. A young family took the seats beside him, the little boy excitedly pointing out planes through the window. Robert smiled, remembering his own childhood fascination with flight. The plane filled up around him, a perfect cross-section of humanity. Business travelers tapping on laptops, tourists chatting eagerly about their destinations, college students with headphones, and families trying to keep children entertained. This was his legacy in motion. As the engines rumbled to life, Robert took a deep breath. He was just a sick man in seat 14B today. Nobody special, nobody important. If only they knew. Flight attendant Diane Thompson had worked for Skyline Airways for 12 years. She considered herself the best at her job, efficient, observant, and able to handle any situation. But Diane had another skill she prided herself on, sizing up passengers at a glance. You can tell everything about people in the first 5 seconds, she often told new crew members during training. It saves time knowing who might cause trouble. Diane stood at the cabin entrance, greeting passengers with practiced smiles as they boarded. Her eyes darted quickly over each person. Business types got her warmest welcome, families with small children received patient nods, and attractive men sometimes got an extra friendly "enjoy your flight." When Robert shuffled forward, Diane's smile dimmed slightly. Her quick assessment registered his worn clothes, thin frame, and tired eyes. In her mental filing system, he went straight into the potential problem category. She gave him a curt nod, barely making eye contact before turning to beam at the well-dressed woman behind him. "Welcome aboard. Right down the aisle. 14B is on your right," she said to Robert, her voice noticeably cooler than it had been for previous passengers. Robert nodded politely. Thank you. As the cabin filled, Diane kept an eye on 14B. She noticed Robert struggling to lift his carry-on into the overhead bin. His arms trembled slightly with the effort, and he winced as if in pain. "Excuse me," he called to her. "I'm sorry, but could I get some help? I'm not feeling my best today." Diane sighed audibly. The Boeing 737 was nearly full, they were behind schedule, and she still had to finish her pre-flight checks. The last thing she needed was someone who couldn't handle basic travel tasks. "Just a moment," she replied, deliberately helping another passenger first, even though they hadn't asked for assistance. When she finally made her way to Robert, her movements were brisk and impatient. She hefted his bag into the bin with a quick, forceful motion. "There you go," she said. Then, just loud enough for nearby rows to hear, she added, "People really shouldn't travel if they can't manage their own bags." Robert looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry to be a bother. I'm just having a rough day." "Aren't we all?" Diane muttered as she turned away. A businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows at the exchange. An elderly woman 3 rows up turned to look, her face showing disapproval at Diane's tone. A college student nearby glanced up from her phone, momentarily confused by the tension. But no one said anything. Robert settled into his seat, taking slow, measured breaths. The pain in his side was getting worse, but he didn't want to cause more trouble. The medication in his bag would help, but he'd need water to take it. That could wait until the beverage service. Meanwhile, Diane continued her pre-flight routine. She watched Robert from the corner of her eye, noting how he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Got another complainer in 14B, she whispered to her colleague in the galley. "You know the type, acts helpless to get special attention." Her colleague glanced down the aisle. "He doesn't look well." "Trust me, I've seen it all," Diane replied, adjusting her perfectly pressed uniform. 12 years on this job. You learn to spot the difficult ones right away." The cabin door closed with a heavy thunk. The safety demonstration began, with Diane performing her part flawlessly, her movements precise and professional. No passenger would guess that behind her perfect smile, she was already categorizing them, deciding who deserved her best service and who didn't. As the plane began to taxi, Robert closed his eyes, trying to focus on something other than his discomfort. He wondered what the flight would reveal about the airline he had built from nothing. So far, it wasn't what he had hoped for. 2 hours into the flight, Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The dull ache in his side had grown into sharp, stabbing pain. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as waves of nausea, a familiar side effect of his recent treatment, washed over him. He'd been hoping to make it through the flight without incident, but now he needed his medication urgently. He reached up with a shaky hand and pressed the call button. The small overhead light blinked on. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The light continued blinking, but no one came. Robert watched as Diane and another flight attendant bustled about in first class, serving drinks and meals with bright smiles. They glanced toward economy several times, clearly seeing the call button, but continued their service up front. After 20 minutes, Robert pressed the button again. His mouth was dry, and the pain had become almost unbearable. The little boy in the window seat looked at him with concern. "Are you okay, mister?" the child asked. "You look really sick." "Just need some water and medicine," Robert managed to reply, trying to smile reassuringly. Finally, after nearly half an hour, Diane approached his row. Her face showed clear annoyance at being summoned. "Yes?" she asked, not even attempting to hide her impatience. "I'm very sorry to bother you," Robert said, his voice weak. "Could I please have some water? I need to take medication for a medical condition." Diane sighed loudly. "We're in the middle of meal service for priority passengers first," she said, gesturing toward first class. Her voice was deliberately loud enough for nearby rows to hear, as if making an example of him. "You'll have to wait your turn like everyone else." "I understand," Robert said, "but this is actually important. I have pancreas." "Everyone has a story," Diane cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Everyone has some reason why they should get special treatment. If I made exceptions for every passenger with a condition, I'd never get anything done." Several passengers around them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman across the aisle looked up from her book, frowning at Diane's tone. "I don't need special treatment," Robert tried again, his breathing becoming shallow. "Just water for medication, please." "You'll get water when we reach this section for beverage service," Diane said firmly. "We have procedures we need to follow." With that, she turned and walked back toward first class. The businessman across the aisle leaned over once Diane was gone. "That was completely uncalled for," he said to Robert. "Here, take my water." "I haven't opened it yet." Robert accepted the bottle with trembling hands. Thank you so much." "No problem. Some people forget what customer service means," the man replied, shooting a glance toward the front of the plane where Diane had disappeared. With the stranger's water, Robert fumbled in his bag for his medication. The small pill felt like a lifeline as he swallowed it down. He'd have to wait at least 20 minutes for it to take effect. The woman behind him tapped his shoulder gently. "Are you all right? You really don't look well." "I'll be okay," Robert assured her, though he wasn't certain that was true. The pain was getting worse, and the nausea had him clenching his jaw to keep from being sick. Another passenger who had witnessed the exchange shook his head in disgust. "I've been flying Skyline for years, but that was terrible. I'm going to file a complaint when we land." "Me too," agreed someone else a few rows back. Robert closed his eyes, listening to the ripple of dissatisfaction spreading among the nearby passengers. This wasn't at all what he'd envisioned when he founded the airline. The motto printed on every Skyline Airways ticket, "Every passenger matters," apparently didn't apply to everyone. The medication wasn't helping. Robert's condition was getting worse by the minute. The pain in his abdomen had spread to his back, and he could barely sit upright anymore. Cold sweat soaked through his shirt as he leaned forward, arms wrapped around himself. The woman in the seat behind him noticed his deteriorating state. She leaned forward and touched his shoulder gently. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked, real concern in her voice. Robert tried to answer but could only shake his head. The businessman who had given him water earlier looked over with alarm. "He needs help," the man said. "Real help, not just water." The woman behind Robert stood up. "I'm a nurse," she announced. "Let me see if I can help." She moved into the aisle and knelt beside Robert's seat. With practiced hands, she checked his pulse and placed her palm against his forehead. "You're burning up," she said. "How long have you been feeling this way?" "It's been getting worse throughout the flight," Robert managed to say. "I have cancer. Treatment side effects sometimes." The nurse looked up with determination. "We need to get you lying down and get proper medical attention." She pressed the call button and then stood in the aisle, looking for a flight attendant. When no one responded after several minutes, she walked purposefully toward the front of the plane. Passengers watched as she approached Diane, who was organizing the drink cart. "Excuse me," the nurse said firmly. "There's a very ill man in row 14. He needs immediate medical attention. He's showing signs of severe distress." Diane barely looked up from her task. "I'd already spoke with him. He just wants special treatment." The nurse's face hardened. "I'm a registered emergency nurse, and I'm telling you this man needs medical attention now. He's displaying symptoms consistent with a serious medical crisis." "Everyone's a doctor or nurse when they want something," Diane replied with a skeptical look. "He's probably just looking for an upgrade." Several nearby passengers gasped at her callous response. "This is completely unacceptable," the nurse said, her voice rising. "I need to speak to your supervisor immediately." "Fine," Diane sighed dramatically. "I'll get the chief flight attendant." As she turned to walk away, Robert, who had tried to stand, suddenly collapsed in the aisle. The pain had become unbearable. As he fell, his wallet tumbled from his pocket and skidded across the floor. A young flight attendant who had been watching the commotion rushed forward to help. She knelt beside Robert as the nurse rolled him into the recovery position. "Sir, can you hear me?" the young attendant asked, reaching for his wrist to check his pulse. As passengers moved out of their seats to give them space, the young flight attendant spotted Robert's wallet. She picked it up, intending to tuck it safely in his jacket. The wallet had fallen open, and a gold ID card caught her eye. Her mouth dropped open as she read the name and title on the card. "Robert Jones, owner and chief executive officer, Skyline Airways Corporation. The color drained from her face. She looked from the cart to the suffering man on the floor and back again. With shaking hands, she tucked the wallet into his jacket pocket and stood up quickly. "I need to get the chief purser," she said urgently to the nurse. "Please, stay with him." She rushed toward the front of the plane, pushing past Diane, who was returning with a first aid kit. "What's the rush?" Diane asked. The young attendant looked at her with wide eyes but said nothing. She continued forward, nearly running to the galley where the chief purser was working. "You need to come right now," she whispered urgently. "The man who collapsed in 14B, it's Robert Jones." "Who?" "Robert Jones," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "The owner of Skyline Airways. Our boss. The actual owner of this entire airline." The chief purser's face went white as paper. "Are you absolutely certain?" she asked the young flight attendant. "I saw his ID myself," the young woman replied, her voice trembling. "Gold executive card with his photo. It's definitely him." "Oh my God," the chief purser whispered. She grabbed the in-flight phone and called the cockpit immediately. After a brief, urgent conversation, she hung up and sprinted down the aisle toward row 14. By now, the passengers had created space around Robert. The nurse was still kneeling beside him, holding his wrist to monitor his pulse. 2 other passengers had offered their blankets to make him more comfortable on the floor. The chief purser pushed through the small crowd, her face a mask of professional concern hiding absolute panic. "Sir, Mr. Jones," she said, kneeling beside him. "I'm Lisa Chen, the chief purser. We're arranging immediate medical assistance for you." Robert's eyes fluttered open. The pain was still intense, but he seemed slightly more alert. "Thank you," he managed to say. Lisa turned to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there are any medical professionals on board, we would greatly appreciate your assistance with a passenger who has taken ill." Almost immediately, a middle-aged man stepped forward. "I'm a doctor," he said. "Emergency medicine." "Thank you, doctor. Please follow me," Lisa said, obvious relief in her voice. As the doctor began examining Robert, the captain's voice came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a passenger requiring medical attention. If there are any additional medical professionals on board, please identify yourselves to the cabin crew. We're also consulting with medical specialists on the ground to determine the best course of action." A second doctor, an older woman, made her way forward to help. Between the 2 doctors and the nurse, they were able to stabilize Robert's condition somewhat. They moved him to a row of empty seats where he could lie down. Meanwhile, word of the passenger's identity had spread like wildfire among the crew. Diane stood frozen in the galley, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief as a colleague whispered the news to her. "That can't be right," she said, shaking her head. "He can't be. I would have recognized." "It's him," her colleague insisted. The chief purser confirmed it. "We've been treating the owner of the entire airline like garbage." Diane felt physically ill. Her 12 years with the company flashed before her eyes. Her job, her livelihood, her reputation, all potentially ruined in a single flight. She straightened her uniform and took a deep breath. "I should apologize," she said, starting toward the makeshift medical area. Lisa stepped directly into her path. "No," she said firmly. "You've done enough. The captain wants you to stay in the forward galley for the remainder of the flight." "But I need to explain." "Not now," Lisa cut her off. "We're focusing on Mr. Jones's medical needs. The captain will speak with you after we land." Back in the main cabin, passengers were buzzing with whispers as they pieced together what was happening. The businessman who had given Robert his water bottle leaned toward another passenger. "Did you get? That guy is apparently the owner of the airline." "You're kidding," the other passenger replied. "The same man that flight attendant was treating so badly." The story traveled from row to row, the details growing with each retelling. Passengers began taking photos and typing on their phones, some undoubtedly sharing the unfolding drama on social media. In the cockpit, the captain had engaged the autopilot and was speaking urgently with medical professionals on the ground. Once he had their advice, he made a difficult decision. Rather than diverting to a closer airport, they would continue to their destination where an emergency medical team would be waiting. Robert's personal doctor had been contacted and confirmed this was the best approach given his specific condition. When it was safe to leave the controls, the captain himself came back to check on the situation. He knelt beside Robert, his face showing genuine concern. "Mr. Jones, I'm Captain Wilson. I'm deeply sorry about what's happened on our flight today. We have medical personnel waiting for us at the gate. Is there anything else we can do for you right now?" Robert looked up at the captain, managed a weak smile, and whispered something only the captain could hear. The plane touched down 15 minutes ahead of schedule. The captain had requested priority landing clearance, which air traffic control had immediately granted. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles waiting on the tarmac. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the PA system, "we have arrived at our destination. Due to the medical situation on board, we ask that you remain seated until our passenger requiring assistance has been transferred to the medical team. Thank you for your patience and understanding." Robert had stabilized somewhat thanks to the care from the doctors and nurse on board. He was still in pain but was alert and able to speak in short sentences. As the plane came to a complete stop, the cabin door opened immediately. Paramedics rushed on board with a stretcher. What happened next surprised everyone. Behind the medical team came 5 men and women in business suits. They moved with urgency and purpose, heading straight for Robert's row. "Mr. Jones," said the lead woman, her face filled with concern. "We came as soon as we heard." The passengers watched with growing interest as they realized these weren't just any people. These were clearly high-ranking executives. "I'm okay, Janet," Robert said to the woman. "Just a bad reaction to the treatment." "We have your personal physician waiting at the hospital," another executive said. "The car is ready to transport you." The paramedics carefully moved Robert onto the stretcher. As they prepared to move him, he raised his hand weakly. "Wait," he said. "I want to thank the passengers who helped me." He looked at the nurse and the businessman who had given him water. "Your kindness means more than you know." The nurse smiled. "Just doing what anyone would do." Robert then looked at the flight doctor. "And thank you, doctor. I'd like to make a donation to any medical charity of your choice." The executives exchanged glances, clearly wanting to get their boss to medical care as quickly as possible, but respectful of his wishes to acknowledge those who had helped him. The chief purser stepped forward. "Mr. Jones, we have a wheelchair if you prefer that to the stretcher. We can take you through the private exit." Robert shook his head. "No, I'll go through the main terminal." "But sir," one of the executives protested, "with your condition and the press might." "I want to go through the main terminal," Robert repeated firmly. No one argued further. Once he was securely on the stretcher, the paramedics began to move him toward the door. The passengers, now understanding who he was, watched in respectful silence. Some nodded to him as he passed their rows. As per airline protocol, the flight attendants lined up at the door to bid passengers farewell as they disembarked. Diane stood at the end of the line, her face pale, eyes downcast. She had been crying in the galley bathroom, her makeup hastily fixed. Robert was the first to leave the aircraft. As he passed the crew line, most of the flight attendants murmured sincere apologies. When he reached Diane, she looked up briefly, her eyes red-rimmed. "Mr. Jones, I'm so sorry," she began. Robert's eyes met hers for a long moment. He didn't speak, but his gaze held a mixture of disappointment and something else harder to define. Then the paramedics continued moving, and the moment passed. As they wheeled him through the jetway, Robert's executive team surrounded him protectively. They moved as a tight unit into the terminal, where curious onlookers began taking photos with their phones. Back on the plane, the rest of the passengers began to disembark. Many stopped to speak to the crew, some expressing outrage, others simply shaking their heads in disapproval. Diane stood frozen in place, forcing a professional smile while enduring the judgmental glances. "You should be ashamed," one elderly woman told her. "That poor man." By evening, the story had spread throughout company headquarters. Emergency meetings were called among department heads. The customer service director looked grim as she reviewed the initial passenger reports that were already flooding in. The HR director was closeted with the legal team, discussing options. No one had heard from Robert yet. He was still at the hospital, surrounded by his closest advisors and medical team. And still, the story hadn't reached the media, but it was only a matter of time. 3 weeks later, Diane sat nervously in the reception area of Skyline Airways headquarters. After the incident, she'd been placed on administrative leave. She had spent those weeks expecting a termination letter to arrive any day. Instead, yesterday she had received a phone call asking her to come to the main office. She checked her watch again. 10 minutes until her appointment. Her stomach twisted with anxiety. The receptionist gave her a polite but cool smile. Clearly, everyone knew who she was and what she had done. "Ms. Thompson." A woman approached. "I'm Janet Wright, Mr. Jones's executive assistant. He'll see you now." Diane stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. This was it. She was about to be fired by the owner himself. She followed Janet down a long hallway lined with photos showing the history of Skyline Airways, from its humble beginnings with 2 planes to its current fleet of over 200 aircraft serving destinations worldwide. Janet stopped at a large wooden door and knocked softly. "Mr. Jones, Ms. Thompson is here." "Please, send her in," came the reply. Janet opened the door and gestured for Diane to enter. The office was large, but surprisingly modest for someone of Robert's wealth and position. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. Robert stood near his desk, looking thinner than he had on the plane, but better than when she'd last seen him on the stretcher. "Thank you for coming, Miss Thompson," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Please, sit down." Diane took a seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mr. Jones, I want to apologize." Robert held up his hand. "Before you continue, there's something I'd like to tell you." He walked slowly to his chair and sat down. "I grew up poor, the kind of poor where you're lucky to have 1 meal a day. My mother cleaned offices at night, including airline offices. Sometimes she'd take me along because we couldn't afford babysitters. I'd sit in the corner with airline magazines, dreaming about flying." He paused, looking out the window briefly before continuing. "When I was 10, my mother saved enough for us to fly to my grandmother's funeral. It was my first time on a plane. I was so excited, but also scared because my clothes were worn and I thought people would look down on us." Robert's eyes met Diane's. "There was a flight attendant on that trip. She noticed how nervous I was and brought me a set of plastic wings. She treated me like I was the most important passenger on that plane, not the least. I never forgot that feeling." Diane swallowed hard, unable to speak. "When I started Skyline Airways," Robert continued, "I had one mission: to create an airline where every single passenger felt valued, where no one was judged by their appearance or their seat assignment, where we remembered that behind every ticket is a human being with their own story." He picked up a folder from his desk. "I could fire you today. Many people have suggested I should. The incident report includes statements from 17 passengers who witnessed your behavior, several recorded videos. The story finally hit the media last week." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "I understand. I'm prepared to accept the consequences." "Here's what I don't understand," Robert said. "Your service record before this was excellent. Top performance evaluations for 12 years. Numerous commendations. What happened on that flight?" Diane took a deep breath. "I've been asking myself the same question. Somewhere along the way, I started categorizing passengers. I stopped seeing people and started seeing problems or stereotypes. I'm not making excuses. There aren't any. What I did was inexcusable." Robert nodded slowly. "I agree, it was inexcusable. But I don't believe in throwing away 12 good years over one terrible day, even if it was my terrible day." He opened the folder. "I'm not firing you. Instead, I'm reassigning you." Diane looked up in shock. "What?" "We're creating a new training program focused on compassionate care, medical response, and recognizing unconscious bias. You're going to help develop it and then deliver it to every employee in the company." "But why would you trust me with this after what I did?" Robert smiled slightly. "Because sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons, and because I believe people can change. The question is, do you?"